The millionaire, marked by sterility, only wanted to help the pregnant woman. But something in him trembled every time he looked at that foreign belly. When the baby is born identical to him, the impossible becomes a real whisper. And the question no one dares to ask threatens to overturn entire lives. Before you go on, tell me which part touched your heart. Your message here makes this space flourish. And take advantage. Subscribe to see the breathtaking conclusion. The rain began to fall heavily that Tuesday, transforming the streets of London into a grey mirror reflecting the lights of buildings and car headlights. Edward Allister drove his black sedan through the avenues of the Kensington area, returning home after another exhausting day of meetings. At 42 years old, he had built an empire in the real estate business, but financial success never filled the void he had carried since he was 25, when a motorcycle accident almost took his life and, according to doctors, forever robbed him of the chance to be a father. Infertility. The word echoed in his mind like a definitive sentence. For years, Edward tried to accept that diagnosis, but the pain never fully healed. He married at 30, to Anna Page, an architect he met at a corporate event. The marriage lasted only 3 years. When she discovered he couldn't give her children, the relationship slowly crumbled, amidst tense conversations about adoption that never progressed, and increasingly distant glances. The divorce came as a silent relief for both, but left Edward even more solitary. The mansion where he lived in Hampstead was too large for just one person. 12 rooms, a spacious garden, a swimming pool, a library he rarely used. The staff came during the day and left in the late afternoon, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the constant feeling that something fundamental was missing from his life. On the most difficult nights, Edward walked through the empty corridors and wondered what was the point of so much space, so much comfort, if there was no one to share it with. It was during this period of solitude that he began visiting children's care institutions. He made generous donations, always anonymously, and sometimes watched the children play in the yard, keeping a safe distance. He didn't want anyone to know who he was or why he was there. He just observed, with a tightness in his chest, imagining what it would be like to have a child run up to him calling him Dad. It was a pain he never verbalized to anyone, not even to Mark, his best friend since college, who knew him better than anyone. That rainy Tuesday, Edward was particularly tired. He had closed an important deal, but the professional victory didn't bring the expected satisfaction. As he drove through the wet streets, he thought about getting home, taking a hot shower, and trying to sleep early. That's when he saw her. Huddled under the awning of a closed shop, a young woman hugged herself, trying to protect herself from the rain that was falling harder and harder. Edward almost drove past, as he always did. The city was full of homeless people, and he already contributed financially to several support institutions. But something in that scene made him hit the brakes. Perhaps it was the way she was hunched over, clearly pregnant, or perhaps it was the expression of despair he could see even from a distance, illuminated by the yellow street lamp light. He parked the car a few meters ahead and grabbed the umbrella from the back seat. The rain beat heavily on the dark fabric as he walked back to the awning. As he approached, he noticed the young woman was trembling violently. It wasn't just the cold. She was moaning softly, one hand on her enormous belly, the other holding the wall as if about to collapse at any moment. Edward, my God, she's in labor, he thought, feeling his heart race. The young woman saw him approach and tried to back away, her eyes wide with fear. Edward raised his free hand in a gesture of peace, keeping his distance. Easy, please. I just want to help. You need a doctor. She shook her head, tears mixing with the rain on her face. She couldn't have been more than 25, dark hair plastered to her forehead, soaked and old clothes. Her voice came out hoarse, almost inaudible. Don't need anyone. Go away. You're unwell. You're having contractions, aren't you? You need to go to a hospital now. I have no money, she replied, her voice breaking. I have nothing. Just leave me here. A new contraction made her double over, groaning in pain. Edward didn't think twice. He approached, holding the umbrella, over both of them, and carefully placed his hand on her arm. I'll take you. I'll take care of everything. You don't need to worry about money. Please, trust me. She looked at him with suspicion, but another contraction came stronger, and this time she almost fell. Edward supported her, feeling her weight lean on him. She was too thin for such a pregnant woman. She was weak, probably malnourished. The urgency of the situation spoke louder than any apprehension. "Come on," he said firmly, guiding her to the car. The drive to the London clinic was tense. Edward drove, fast but carefully, while the young woman moaned in the back seat, contractions becoming more frequent. He called the hospital, informing them he was arriving with an obstetric emergency. When he finally parked at the emergency entrance, a team was already waiting for them with a wheelchair. In the following minutes, everything happened very quickly. The young woman was taken to a delivery room, and Edward stayed at the reception, providing his own details for admission, as she had no documents. He said he would be responsible for all costs. The attendant looked at him with curiosity, but asked no questions. Money spoke loudly, especially in private hospitals. Edward sat in the waiting room, still wet from the rain, his heart beating erratically. He didn't know why he was there. He didn't know that woman. He could have left her at the hospital door and gone. But something held him there, an inexplicable force he couldn't name. An hour later, a nurse came to him. "Mr. Alistair, the patient is asking for you." He stood up, surprised. Why would she be asking for me, he thought, but followed the nurse through the corridors to the delivery room. When he entered, he found the young woman on the gurney, connected to monitors, her face pale and sweaty. She saw him and her eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to be alone," she said in a weak voice. "Please, stay here." Edward nodded, approaching and pulling up a chair beside the gurney. He didn't know what to do, but felt he needed to be there. A doctor entered the room, checked the monitors, and announced that delivery would be soon. The baby was engaged and contractions regular. For the next hour, Edward stayed beside that young woman whose name he still didn't know. She held his hand tightly with each contraction, and he spoke words of encouragement without knowing if they helped or not. At some point, between one contraction and another, she began to tell her story. "My name is Marianne," she said, her voice choked. "Marianne Croft. I was kicked out of my home 3 weeks ago." Edward listened in silence as she recounted, between pauses of pain, how she had discovered that the partner she had lived with for 2 years had another family, a legitimate wife and 2 children in another neighborhood. When Marianne became pregnant and he found out he wanted nothing to do with it, he told her to fend for herself. Marianne, with no close family and her parents having passed away years ago, tried to stay with a friend, but the situation became unsustainable. She ended up on the streets, trying to survive on the little she could get from donations. "I tried to endure," she said, crying. "I tried to wait a little longer, but the pain started this afternoon and didn't stop. I didn't know what to do." "You'll be fine," Edward replied, surprised by the emotion in his own voice. "You and your baby will be fine." Another contraction, stronger. The doctor asked her to push. Edward continued holding her hand, feeling strangely connected to that moment. It wasn't just compassion, it was something deeper, more visceral. He couldn't explain it. And then, after minutes that felt like hours, a cry echoed through the room. Strong, healthy, full of life. The doctor lifted the baby, still connected by the umbilical cord, and announced with a smile, "It's a boy." Marianne broke down in tears, and Edward felt something break inside him. The baby was quickly cleaned and placed in his mother's arms. She held him with a mixture of love and exhaustion, her eyes fixed on his red, wrinkled face. Edward watched from his standing position beside the gurney and felt a wave of emotion he hadn't expected. It was as if something within him recognized that moment as sacred, as a turning point. "He's perfect," Marianne whispered, running her finger over her son's cheeks. The doctor excused herself to perform post-delivery procedures, and Edward left the room for a few minutes. He stood in the corridor, leaning against the wall, trying to understand what he was feeling. He had witnessed the birth of a child that wasn't his, from a woman he didn't know. But something about that baby, that cry, that moment, affected him in a way he couldn't explain. When he returned to the room, Marianne was already in a private room. Edward had requested the best available room, with a private bathroom and accommodation for a companion. She was lying on the bed, the baby sleeping in a crib beside her. She seemed exhausted but calmer. "Thank you," she said, when she saw him enter. "Thank you for everything. I'll never forget what you did." Edward pulled up a chair and sat near the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. "No need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she replied, shaking her head. "That's not true. Many people passed by me today and no one stopped. You stopped. You saved us." They were silent for a moment. Edward looked at the crib, where the baby slept peacefully, wrapped in a light blue hospital blanket. His tiny heart beat visibly in his small chest, his minuscule fingers. Everything about him was perfect, fragile, new. "Do you have somewhere to go when you leave here?" Edward asked. Marianne averted her gaze, her eyes welling up again. "No, I have no one." Edward knew he was about to do something impulsive, something completely out of character for his cautious and planned nature, but the words came out before he could think better. "Then come to my house, you and the baby. Stay until you recover, until you can get organized. You don't need to be on the street." Marianne stared at him, surprised and suspicious at the same time. "Why? Why would you do that?" Edward hesitated. He didn't have a clear answer. He just knew he couldn't leave them on the street. "Because you need it, and because I have space to spare, nothing more than that. But you don't know me. You don't know who I am. And you don't know me either. But sometimes life puts us in situations where we need to trust. I won't harm you, Marianne. I just want to help." She studied his face for a long moment, looking for any sign of ill intent, but all she saw was sincerity and tiredness, and something else she couldn't identify, an old sadness perhaps, a deep loneliness. "All right," she finally agreed, "but only until I can get a job and a place to stay. I don't want to be a burden to anyone." Agreed. They stayed there, in the quiet of the hospital room, while outside the rain continued to fall over London. Edward looked at the baby again and felt, for the first time in years, a glimmer of hope. He didn't know why he was doing that. He didn't know where that decision would lead him. But he knew, with an inexplicable certainty, that he was in the right place, at the right time. In the following days, Edward took care of everything. He bought clothes for Marianne and a complete layette for the baby. Crib, stroller, clothes, diapers, bottles, everything the best money could buy. He also hired a lactation consultant and a nurse for the first few days at home, ensuring Marianne and the baby had all the necessary support. When she was finally discharged, 3 days after giving birth, Marianne still hadn't chosen a name for her son. Edward took her to the mansion on a sunny day, completely different from the rainy night they met. She entered the house with the baby, in her arms, her eyes wide at the grandeur of the place. "Is this where you live?" she asked, incredulous. "Yes. I know it's too big for one person." Marianne walked slowly through the living room, observing the expensive furniture, the artworks on the walls, the high ceiling. She felt out of place, as if she didn't belong in that world, but Edward gently guided her upstairs, where he had prepared a room for her and a smaller one next to it, which he improvised as a nursery. "You'll stay here," he said, opening the door to a spacious room, with a king-size bed, walk-in closet and private bathroom. "The baby's room is right next door. If you need anything during the night, just call me. My room is at the end of the corridor." Marianne entered the room, placed the baby in the new crib Edward had assembled, and sat on the bed, exhausted. She felt torn between immense gratitude and the discomfort of accepting so much help from a stranger. But she looked at her son, sleeping peacefully, and knew she had made the right decision. There they would be safe. There she could recover and plan for the future. "Thank you, Edward, truly. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for all this." "No need to repay anything. Just take care of yourself and your son. That's enough." In the first few days, living together was strange. Marianne kept her distance, interacting with Edward only as necessary. She stayed in her room most of the time, breastfeeding the baby, trying to recover from childbirth. Edward respected her space, but always checked if she needed anything. He asked the cook to prepare nutritious meals and personally brought the trays up to the room. Gradually, Marianne began to Feel more at ease. She started coming down for meals, walking in the garden with the baby in her arms, talking more openly with Edward. She discovered he was a kind, discreet, generous man, completely different from the ex-partner who had abandoned her. One night, after the baby finally fell asleep after hours of crying, Marianne went down to the kitchen for water. She found Edward sitting at the kitchen table, drinking tea and staring into space. "Can't sleep?" she asked. Edward turned, a little surprised. "Sometimes I have insomnia, and you?" "The baby cried a lot today. I think it's colic." She sat at the table, accepting the cup of tea he offered her. They sat in silence for a moment, a comfortable silence. "Edward, why are you so alone?" Marianne asked suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness. He hesitated, stirring his cup. "It's a long story. I have time." And then, for the first time, Edward told his story. He spoke of the accident, the infertility diagnosis, the failed marriage, the loneliness that had become his sole companion. He spoke of the visits to children's institutions, the silent pain of never being able to be a father. Marianne listened attentively, her eyes welling up. "I'm so sorry," she said. "It must be very difficult." "It was, it still is. But somehow, having you two here made everything a little more bearable." They looked at each other, and something unsaid passed between them. A connection was beginning to form, still fragile but real. "Have you ever thought about adopting?" Marianne asked. "I did, but I always thought it wouldn't be the same. And after the divorce, I thought it would be better to just be alone, easier." "You're a good man, Edward. Any child would be lucky to have you as a father." He smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Thank you, that means a lot." In the days that followed, the routine of the house changed completely. The baby's cries echoed through the corridors, bringing life to that space that was once too silent. Edward began to help Marianne with small tasks, holding the baby so she could bathe or rest a little. At first he did it with apprehension, afraid of hurting him, but little by little he got the hang of it, learning to change diapers, burp the baby and rock him in his arms. And it was during one of those nights, with the baby crying incessantly and Marianne exhausted, that something changed. Edward went up to the room, found Marianne on the verge of a nervous breakdown, crying along with her son. Without saying anything, he picked up the baby and began walking around the room, rocking him with gentle movements. "Go to sleep, Marianne. I'll take care of him now." "But he's hungry. He needs to feed." "Then rest until he needs to again. I'll just rock him for a bit." Marianne lay down, too exhausted to argue. Edward continued walking around the room, whispering nonsensical words to the baby. And then it happened. The baby stopped crying. He looked at Edward with those dark, still unfocused eyes, and somehow seemed to calm down. In a few minutes, he was sleeping peacefully in his arms. Edward stood still, afraid to move and wake him. He looked at that tiny face, at the minuscule eyelashes, at the slightly open mouth, and he felt something explode within his chest. It was love. Pure, unconditional, overwhelming. It wasn't logical, it wasn't rational, but it was real. That night, something changed irreversibly. Edward was no longer just a benefactor offering temporary shelter. He was becoming attached. He was allowing himself to dream. And that, he knew, was dangerous, because that baby wasn't his. That life wasn't his. But how do you turn off a feeling that already had such deep roots? When he finally managed to put the baby in the crib without waking him, Edward looked at Marianne, already fast asleep. She seemed so young, so fragile. She had been through so much. And there she was, trusting him to care for what was most precious to her. Edward left the room in silence and went to his own room. But he couldn't sleep. He lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about how unpredictable life is. 3 weeks ago, his routine was solitary and predictable. Now there was a baby in his house, a mother trying to recover, and he, a man who believed he had lost everything, discovering that there was still room to feel. The next day, Marianne woke up more rested. She found Edward in the kitchen, making coffee. "Thank you for yesterday," she said, still shy. "You're welcome. The little one calmed down quickly." "He seems to like you." Edward smiled but said nothing. He didn't know how to express what he felt. He didn't know if he should. "Edward, I need to choose a name for him. It's been almost 2 weeks and he still doesn't have a name." "Have you thought of any?" Marianne shook her head. "Nothing feels right. I wanted a special name, you know, a name that meant new beginnings. Hope." Edward thought for a moment. "How about Gabriel? It means messenger of good news. Or Daniel, which means God is my judge." Marianne smiled. "Gabriel. I like Gabriel." "Then Gabriel it is. And that's how the baby finally received a name, Gabriel. And with that name, a new chapter began. The house that was once a mausoleum of Edward's solitude was now a home. Still fragile, still temporary, but a home. However, neither Edward nor Marianne knew that this was just the beginning of a much more complex story. A story that would involve secrets from the past, impossible revelations, and a destiny that had been intertwined long before that rainy night they first met. Because sometimes life is not just a sequence of coincidences, sometimes there's a hidden purpose, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And Edward was about to discover that the impossible might just be a truth yet to be revealed. The first few months with Gabriel in the mansion completely transformed Edward Alistair's routine. The methodical and solitary man who once spent his days between meetings and his nights in silence now woke up to the baby's cries at 3 in the morning, learned to distinguish between hunger cries and colic cries, and discovered a patience he didn't know he possessed. Marianne also changed. The frightened and suspicious young woman he had found in the rain began to recover, both physically and emotionally. Her eyes began to shine again, especially when she looked at Gabriel, but Edward noticed that she still carried deep hurts. Sometimes, in the middle of a conversation, she would become distant, lost in thoughts that clearly pained her. It was on a Saturday morning, 3 months after Gabriel's birth, that Edward realized how much that temporary situation had become permanent in his heart. He was in his office trying to review some contracts when he heard laughter coming from the garden. He stood up and went to the window. Down below, Marianne was sitting on a blanket on the grass, Gabriel in her lap, showing him the colorful flowers in the flower bed. The baby stretched his chubby little hands trying to reach the petals, and she laughed, gently redirecting him. Edward stood there, watching that simple and perfect scene. He felt a pain in his chest, but it was a good pain, the pain of someone falling in love not with a person, but with an entire life, for a possibility of a future that once seemed impossible. At that moment, Marianne looked up and saw him at the window. She waved with a smile, and Edward waved back. Without realizing it, he smiled too. A genuine smile, one he hadn't given in years. He went down to the garden and sat on the blanket beside them. Gabriel immediately turned his little head towards him and let out a whimper that quickly turned into a smile when Edward picked him up. "He recognizes your voice," Marianne commented. "Whenever you get close, he gets all excited like that." "Really?" Edward asked, surprised and touched. "Really. I think you've become his favorite person." Edward looked at Gabriel, who was holding his index finger tightly with his tiny hand. The baby's dark eyes were fixed on him, curious and bright. "He's growing fast," Edward commented. "I know. He's almost doubled his birth weight. The pediatrician said he's developing very well." "You've been an amazing mother, Marianne." She looked away, blushing slightly. "I'm trying. I'm still very afraid of doing everything wrong." "You're not. Believe me." They stayed there in the garden for over an hour, playing with Gabriel, talking about trivial matters. Edward realized those were his favorite moments of the day, not the important meetings or the millionaire deals, but those simple moments with Marianne and Gabriel under the morning sun. In the afternoon, after Gabriel fell asleep, Edward had to go to the company's central office to resolve some pending matters. Marianne stayed home, taking advantage of the free time to organize the baby's clothes that were already getting small. That's when the housekeeper, Mrs. Connolly, a 60-year-old woman who had worked for Edward for over 10 years, entered the room with a large envelope in her hands. "Miss Marianne, I was tidying up Dr. Edward's office and found this. I thought you might like to see it." Marianne took the envelope, curious. Inside were several old photographs. In the first, Edward appeared much younger, perhaps in his early 20s at some birthday or party. She smiled, seeing how different he was, with more hair and that carefree air of someone who hadn't yet known life's disappointments. But it was the second photo that left her paralyzed. It was an image taken in front of an institution with the name Hope Haven written on the sign. In the background, several children played in the yard. And there, on the right side of the photo in profile, a pregnant woman smiled as she helped a child tie their shoelace. Her hair tied in a ponytail, a simple cotton dress, her large belly. It was her, Marianne. Her hands began to tremble. She turned the photo over and saw a date, 8 months ago. Exactly around the time she was 7 months pregnant, and with nowhere to go began volunteering at Hope Haven in exchange for some meals. "Mrs. Connolly, where did Dr. Edward get this photo?" she asked with a trembling voice. "Oh, that one's from the institution he's been visiting for years. The doctor always made donations to Hope Haven, but he never told anyone. I only found out because one day I needed to take some documents for him to sign, and he was just returning from there. He's a very kind-hearted man, my dear." Marianne kept looking at the photo, trying to process what it meant. Edward frequented the same institution where she volunteered. They had been in the same place at the same time and hadn't met, or at least didn't remember meeting. Was it possible he had seen her that day? Was it possible that encounter on the rainy night wasn't just a coincidence? She carefully put the photo away, her heart racing. She didn't know what to think. She didn't know what that changed or didn't change, but she felt a shiver run down her spine, as if fate was trying to tell her something. When Edward arrived home that night, Marianne was in the living room, Gabriel sleeping in the stroller beside her. She held the photo in her hands. "Edward, can I ask you a question?" "Of course," he replied, sitting in the armchair opposite her. Marianne held out the photo. "Mrs. Connolly showed me this today. It's from Hope Haven, isn't it?" Edward took the photo, surprised. He was silent for a moment, observing the image. "Yes, it is. I used to visit that institution. I made donations." "I know," she told me. "But look here, Edward. In the corner of the photo, that pregnant woman. It's me." He looked more closely, bringing the photo closer to his eyes. And then he saw. It really was Marianne in profile, but unmistakable. "My God," he murmured. "You were there that day." "I volunteered there when I was pregnant. I didn't have much to do, and they gave me food in exchange for helping with the children. Went there twice a week." Edward continued looking at the photo, trying to remember that specific day. He had visited Hope Haven dozens of times over the years. He always watched from afar, never getting too close. Had he seen her that day and not remembered, or had he simply not paid attention? "I don't remember seeing you," he admitted, "but I always kept my distance. I observed the children, but didn't interact much. Do you think it's strange? Us being in the same place, me pregnant, and then you finding me that night?" Edward thought for a long moment. "I don't know if it's strange. Maybe it's just life saying that some encounters are inevitable. Some people are destined to cross paths, no matter how long it takes." Marianne felt a shiver. There was something true in those words, something that made sense in a way she couldn't rationally explain. "Do you believe in destiny?" she asked. "I don't know. I never really believed in those things. I was always very rational, very pragmatic. But after I met you, after Gabriel was born, I started to wonder if there isn't something bigger that we don't understand." They sat in silence, the photo between them like a bridge between past and present. In the following months, life in the mansion continued its new routine. Gabriel grew rapidly, becoming smarter and more interactive each day. He started rolling over, then sitting up on his own. And by 6 months, he was already practicing the first sounds that could become words. Edward was present for every important milestone in the baby's development, documenting everything in photos and videos that he later watched alone in his room, with a silly smile on his face. Marianne also flourished. Her body fully recovered from childbirth, and she began to take care of herself again. She started taking morning walks with Gabriel in the stroller, began helping with the house organization even when Mrs. Connolly insisted she didn't need to, and even enrolled in an online business administration course, thinking about getting a job once Gabriel was a little older. But what neither of them admitted out loud was how much they were growing closer. It wasn't just daily cohabitation or shared care for Gabriel. It was something deeper. The glances that lingered a few seconds longer, the hands that accidentally touched and were slow to pull away. The conversations that stretched into the early hours, when Gabriel finally slept and they met in the kitchen, drinking tea and talking about everything and nothing. Edward fought against that feeling. He told himself that Marianne was just a temporary guest, that soon she would leave and go on with her life, that he had no right to fall in love with her, that it would be taking advantage of a vulnerable situation. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize, his heart didn't obey logic. Marianne felt the same. She noticed how much Edward cared for her and Gabriel. She saw the way he looked at her son with genuine paternal love. She noticed the small gestures of affection, the concern, the dedication, and she felt confused because she liked him. She liked him a lot, but she was afraid of giving herself again and being abandoned, afraid that it was just charity and not love, afraid of ruining the only stable situation she had at the moment. It was on a Thursday night, when Gabriel turned 8 months old, that something changed between them. Edward had arrived home early from work and found Marianne crying in the room, Gabriel sleeping in the crib beside her. He knocked on the half-open door and entered slowly. "Marianne, what happened?" She tried to dry her tears quickly but couldn't hide them. "Nothing. Just something silly." "It doesn't seem silly. You're crying." She sobbed, holding an envelope in her hand. "I received a message from Robert today, my ex. He wants to see Gabriel." Edward felt something tighten in his chest. Robert, the man who abandoned Marianne pregnant, the man who left her on the streets, and now he wanted to see Gabriel. "What did you reply?" No, that he lost that right when he kicked me out of the house. But he's threatening to go to court. Says he's the father and has rights." "Is he the father?" Edward asked, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. Marianne stared at him, her eyes red. "Legally, yes. His name is on the birth certificate, but he was never a real father. He never wanted to know about Gabriel. He never cared." Edward sat on the bed beside her, maintaining a respectful but present distance. "He won't take Gabriel from you, Marianne. I won't let him." "Can you stop him? He has rights." "Because I'll use all the resources I have. I'll hire the best lawyers. I'll prove he abandoned you. I'll protect both of you." Marianne looked at him, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. "Why, Edward? Why do you care so much?" He hesitated. The words were there, on the tip of his tongue, ready to come out. But he was afraid of scaring her, afraid of losing everything. "Because you two are important to me. Very important." The silence that followed was laden with meaning. Marianne could feel her heart beating, strongly in her chest. She knew what those words meant. She knew what was happening between them, and for the first time she allowed herself to consider the possibility. "You're important to me too," she said softly. "More than I should admit." "Why shouldn't you?" "Because I'm afraid of being hurt again, afraid that all this is temporary, afraid that you'll wake up one day and realize you don't want us here." Edward, on an impulse, took her hand. It was the first deliberately affectionate touch between them. "Marianne, I don't know when it happened. I don't know if it was that first night or if it was gradually. But I fell in love with both of you. When I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is you. When I'm working, I look forward to coming home. This mansion is no longer just a house. It's become a home. Because of you." Her tears fell again, but now they were different tears. "I also fell in love with you," she confessed. "I tried to fight it. I tried to convince myself it was just gratitude. But it's not. It's much more." Edward approached slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted, but Marianne didn't pull back. When their lips touched, it was as if everything fell into place, as if that kiss was the answer to questions neither of them knew how to ask. The kiss was soft, delicate, full of unspoken promises. When they separated, Edward rested his forehead against hers. "I won't let anyone hurt you again, neither you nor Gabriel. You are my family now, and you are ours." That night, everything changed, not abruptly, but with a new clarity. What was once uncertain now had a path. What was once temporary now had the possibility of being eternal. In the following days, the relationship between Edward and Marianne evolved naturally. Dinners that were once casual turned into romantic dates. Conversations that were once between friends turned into confidences between a couple. Edward began to include her in his decisions, ask for her opinion on business, treat her as a true partner and not just a guest. Marianne, in turn, began to take care of the house with more ownership, not because she felt obliged, but because that space was now hers too. She reorganized some rooms, brought life to corners that were once cold and impersonal. The mansion began to reflect her presence, and Edward loved every change, but the more time passed, the more Edward noticed something that intrigued him and at the same time deeply disturbed him. Gabriel was growing, and with his growth his physical characteristics became more defined, and some of these characteristics were strangely familiar. The shape of his eyes, slightly almond-shaped, the way he furrowed his brow when he was concentrating, the dimple on his left cheek when he smiled, the birthmark on his right arm in the shape of a crescent moon. Edward had all these characteristics, exactly the same. At first he tried to ignore it. He told himself it was a coincidence, that many people had similar eyes or dimples, but the more Gabriel grew, the more evident the similarities became. And it wasn't just him who noticed. One day Mark, his best friend, came to visit him. They hadn't seen each other in months, and Edward had told him on the phone about Marianne and Gabriel, but Mark hadn't met them in person yet. When he entered the mansion and saw Gabriel crawling across the living room, Mark stood still, open-mouthed. "Edward, is this your baby?" he asked bluntly. "No, he's Marianne's son, you know that." "Man, he's identical to you. Look at the dimple, look at the way he looks. It's you in miniature." Edward tried to laugh, but he was uncomfortable. "Coincidence." Mark looked at him with a serious expression. "Are you sure he's not your biological son?" "I'm sure, Mark. I'm infertile. The doctors were very clear about that." "But have you had recent tests? Because, man, I swear this baby is just like you." Edward was restless for the rest of the day. Mark's words echoed in his head. He knew it was impossible. The doctors had been categorical 17 years ago. The motorcycle accident had caused irreversible damage. The infertility was definitive. There was no possibility of cure, no treatment. It was a fact. But then why did Gabriel look so much like him? That night, while Marianne was bathing Gabriel, Edward watched them from the doorway. The baby laughed, splashed water, completely happy. Marianne sang a children's song, her voice soft and melodious. It was a perfect scene, a scene he wanted to keep forever. "Are you all right?" Marianne asked, noticing him standing there. "I am, just observing." "Want to help?" "I do." He entered the bathroom, grabbed a towel and waited. When Marianne took Gabriel out of the bathtub, Edward wrapped him in the towel and began to dry him carefully. The baby looked at him with those dark eyes and smiled, showing the 2 teeth that had recently emerged. At that moment, Edward had an absolute certainty. It didn't matter whose biological son Gabriel was. That boy was his. In his heart, in his soul, in everything that truly mattered. He loved Gabriel as if he were his own, flesh and blood, and nothing would change that. But the doubt planted by Mark remained there, growing silently, and Edward knew that, sooner or later, he would have to face it. Because if there was one thing he had learned in recent months, it was that some truths cannot be ignored forever. They always find a way to emerge. As he put Gabriel to sleep that night, Edward looked at the baby's peaceful face and whispered a promise. "No matter what happens, I will always protect you. I will always be your father. Always." And in those simple words lay a profound truth that would still take time to be fully understood. Because sometimes fatherhood is not defined by DNA or blood ties. It is defined by love, presence, dedication. But sometimes, when we least expect it, the universe reveals that the heart already knew something that the mind hadn't yet processed. And for Edward, that revelation was closer than he could imagine. Because destiny, when it decides to write a story, leaves no loose ends. And the story of Edward, Marianne, and Gabriel was only just beginning to reveal its deepest and most surprising layers. Gabriel turned one amidst a party that transformed the mansion's garden into an explosion of colors and joy. Edward spared no effort. He hired decorators, a children's buffet, entertainers, and even a small mobile zoo with docile animals for the children to interact with. Marianne was surprised by the magnitude of the celebration. "Edward, he's only one." "You didn't need to do all this," she said, as she watched the preparations on the eve. "But I want to. I want it to be unforgettable. How many times in life do we celebrate someone's first birthday?" Marianne smiled, touched. "In the last 6 months, since they made their relationship official, her life had changed almost magically. Edward was not only materially generous, he was present, attentive, affectionate. He treated her like a queen, and Gabriel like a prince. Sometimes she pinched herself, thinking it was all just a dream from which she would wake up at any moment. On the day of the party, more than 50 people showed up. Edward's friends, some colleagues from the company, neighbors, and even some children from Hope Haven, whom Edward insisted on inviting. Marianne was surprised by his generosity, offering transportation and ensuring that the children from the institution could enjoy the party as much as any other child present. Gabriel, dressed in a navy and white sailor outfit, was radiant. He crawled quickly through the garden, exploring everything, laughing with the animals from the small zoo. When it was time for the birthday song, Edward held him in his arms in front of the ocean-themed cake. Marianne stood beside him, singing along with all the guests. It was at that moment, with dozens of eyes on them, that cameras captured something everyone would later comment on. Gabriel and Edward, side by side, bore a striking resemblance. The way both crinkled their noses when they smiled, the identical shape of their eyebrows, the same dimple on their left cheek. It was as if he were a miniature version of the businessman. When it was time to blow out the candle, Gabriel just looked confused at the flame. Edward helped, blowing with him, and everyone applauded. In that moment of celebration, surrounded by people he loved, Edward had a silent revelation. He was happy, completely happy. For the first time in over 15 years, he didn't feel that constant emptiness in his chest. Loneliness had been replaced by love, by family, by purpose. During the party, several guests made comments. "Edward, your son is beautiful, congratulations," said a colleague. "He's not my biological son," Edward corrected, but the smile on his face was genuine. "Oh, sorry, I thought he was. You're so alike." This happened more than a dozen times during the afternoon, people presuming Gabriel was Edward's son, and him having to politely correct them. But deep down, every time someone made that comment, something stirred within him, a mixture of joy at looking like father and son, and a pang of pain that it wasn't true. Mark, who was there with his wife and 2 young children, pulled Edward aside at the end of the afternoon. "Man, you need to get a DNA test. Mark, we've talked about this. I'm infertile. What if the diagnosis was wrong? What if there was a mistake? Because, Edward, it's not just me saying it. Half the people here commented on the resemblance. The boy is identical to you." Edward looked to where Gabriel was playing with other children on the lawn, closely watched by Marianne. "Even if there was a slight possibility, what would change? I already love Gabriel as my son. I already take care of him. I already worry about him. A piece of paper won't change what I feel. But it would change everything legally, especially with Marianne's ex-boyfriend wanting rights over Gabriel. If you are the biological father, he has no claim." Edward fell silent. Robert, Marianne's ex, had tried to contact her twice more in recent months, always with veiled threats, always trying to take advantage of the situation. Edward had hired lawyers to deal with the situation, but they hadn't been able to resolve it definitively yet. "I'll think about it," Edward finally replied. "Don't think too much. Sometimes the answer we most need to hear is the one we're most afraid to seek." Mark's words echoed in Edward's head for the following days. He observed Gabriel with heightened attention, every gesture, every expression, every movement, and the more he observed, the more the similarities jumped out. It wasn't just physical. It was behavioral, too. The way Gabriel crinkled his nose when he didn't like something, the silent stubbornness when he didn't want to do something, the way he tilted his head to the side when he was curious. Edward had seen photos of himself as a baby, kept by his mother in old albums, and the resemblance was unsettling. If he put a photo of Gabriel next to his baby photos, it would be hard to distinguish who was who. On a Friday night, 2 weeks after Gabriel's birthday, Edward decided to broach the subject with Marianne. They were in her room, Gabriel already fast asleep in the crib beside them. Edward and Marianne had developed a deep emotional intimacy, but still didn't sleep in the same room. He respected her timing, waiting for her to take the next step. "Marianne, I need to ask you a question, and I need you to be completely honest with me," Edward began, sitting on the edge of the bed as she brushed her hair in front of the mirror. She stopped, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "You can ask. Are you absolutely sure that Robert is Gabriel's father?" Marianne froze, the comb suspended in the air. She slowly turned to face him. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because a lot of people have commented on the resemblance between Gabriel and me. And it's not just physical, it's everything. His mannerisms, his expressions. Mark even suggested I get a DNA test." Marianne placed the comb on the dressing table, her hands trembling slightly. "Edward, you know it's impossible. You told me about your diagnosis, about the infertility. I know that. But what if it was wrong? What if there was a medical error?" She stood up and walked to the window, hugging herself. She remained silent for a long moment. "I haven't been with anyone else besides Robert," she finally said. "But the relationship was already terrible in the last few months. We barely spoke, and when I discovered his other family, that was the end." "When was the last time you were together? Before you found out about his other family?" Marianne closed her eyes, trying to remember. "It was at a company Christmas party where he worked. In December, almost a year and a half ago. We drank, and it just happened. But after that, nothing else. He started avoiding me, coming home late, making excuses. I found out about his other family in February when I was already 2 months pregnant." "And are you sure you got pregnant that December night?" Marianne hesitated. "I always presumed so because it was the only time in months. But Edward, I didn't get any paternity test. When Robert kicked me out of the house, I only put his name on the birth certificate because he demanded it. He said if I didn't, he'd report me for who knows what. I was so confused, so scared that I just signed." Edward stood up and went to her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Marianne. I'm just trying to understand. Because if there's a chance, however small, that Gabriel is my biological son, I need to know. And if he is, what changes?" "Everything changes. It changes that I'm not just a stepfather. It changes that he's my blood son. It changes that Robert has no rights over him. It changes the way I see everything that happened since that rainy night." Marianne turned to him, her eyes welling up. "You want to do the test?" "I do. But only if you agree." She thought for a moment, her heart pounding. The possibility of Edward being Gabriel's biological father was both frightening and comforting. Frightening because it would change everything she believed about that period of her life. Comforting because it would mean Gabriel was always destined to have Edward as a father, even before he was born. "Okay, let's do the test. But you need to be prepared for any result." "I am prepared." But they weren't. Neither of them was truly prepared for what that test could reveal. The following Monday, Edward scheduled an appointment with a private geneticist, known for his discretion and efficiency. He took Marianne and Gabriel with him. The office was modern, discreet, with neutral-toned walls and soft music playing in the background. Dr. Henry Sampson received them with professionalism. A middle-aged man with grey hair and thin-rimmed glasses, he listened attentively as Edward explained the situation. "I see," said the doctor. "You want a paternity test to confirm if you are the child's biological father." "Yes, and we'd like to have the result as quickly as possible. I can have the result in 3 business days with the expedited process. I'll need to collect DNA samples from all 3 of you. It's a simple procedure, just a saliva swab." The collection was quick and painless. Gabriel didn't even cry, just seemed curious about the swab in his mouth. When they left the office, Edward was tense. Marianne was too. The next 3 days would be a torture of anxiety and speculation. During those 3 days, Edward could barely concentrate on work. He cancelled important meetings, delegated tasks he would normally do personally. He spent sleepless nights lying in the dark of his room, imagining all the possibilities. What if Gabriel was his son? How was it possible? The diagnosis had been made by renowned doctors in one of the best clinics in London. They had been so categorical. Irreversible infertility due to the trauma in the accident. How could such a diagnosis be wrong? But what if it was? What if that accident hadn't caused permanent damage? What if his body had recovered over the years without him knowing? Medicine wasn't an exact science. Errors happened. Diagnoses changed. Marianne also didn't sleep well. She kept looking at Gabriel while he slept, trying to find answers in his innocent little face. If Edward was the father, it meant they had met for a greater purpose. It meant the universe had conspired to unite them. But it also meant that she had become pregnant unknowingly by a man she didn't even know at the time. How could that be possible? She tried to remember that time. December, almost a year and a half ago, Robert's company Christmas party. She had drunk a little more than usual. She vaguely remembered the night, but the details were hazy. She remembered being with Robert, but she also remembered going out alone at some point for air. She was dizzy, confused. Could something have happened that night that she didn't remember? Was it possible? The more she thought, the more her head ached. She decided not to torture herself with speculation and just wait for the test result. On Thursday morning, Edward's phone rang. It was Dr. Henry. "Mr. Alistair, the results are ready. Would you like to pick them up in person or prefer I send them by email?" "I'll pick them up in person. Can I come now?" "Of course. I'll wait for you here." Edward hung up with trembling hands. He looked at the clock. 9 in the morning. Marianne and Gabriel were still asleep. He quickly wrote a note saying he had gone out to take care of something and would be back soon, left it on the kitchen table and left. London's traffic was chaotic as always, but Edward barely noticed. He drove on autopilot, his heart beating too fast in his chest. In less than an hour, he was parking in front of the clinic building. He went up the elevator, the white envelope tucked under his arm. When he entered the waiting room, the receptionist recognized him immediately. "Dr. Henry is waiting for you, Mr. Alistair. You can go in." Edward entered the office. The doctor was sitting behind his desk, the sealed envelope in hand. "Mr. Alistair, before opening the envelope, I need to ask you some questions about your medical history." "Of course. You mentioned receiving an infertility diagnosis after an accident. Can you tell me more details?" Edward recounted the motorcycle accident at 25, the pelvic trauma, the consultations with urologists, the tests that confirmed infertility. Dr. Henry listened attentively, making notes. "And did you have medical follow-ups after that? New tests over the years?" "No. The doctors were very clear that there was no treatment, that it was definitive, so I simply accepted it." Dr. Henry nodded slowly. "I understand. Well, Mr. Alistair, cases of spontaneous recovery are rare, but not impossible. The human body has a capacity for healing that sometimes surprises even the most experienced doctors. But let's get to the result." He carefully opened the envelope and took out a printed sheet. He read in silence for a few seconds before looking up at Edward. "Mr. Alistair, according to the DNA test, there is a 99.9% probability that you are the biological father of Gabriel Croft Alistair." Edward's world stopped, literally stopped. He heard the words, processed them intellectually but emotionally. It was as if he had been punched in the stomach. "I'm sure this is a shock," the doctor continued, "but the results are conclusive. You are the child's biological father." Edward couldn't speak. Tears came without warning, streaming down his face. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders trembling. It wasn't sadness. It was a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, relief, joy, confusion, all at once. Dr. Henry waited patiently, offering a tissue. "I know it must be overwhelming. Take all the time you need." After a few minutes, Edward managed to compose himself minimally. How is this possible? The doctors were so categorical. As I said, the human body is surprising. It's possible that the damage wasn't as permanent as believed. It's possible there was regeneration over the years. Or it's possible that the initial diagnosis was inaccurate. Without seeing your old exams, I can't say for sure, but the fact is that you are not infertile. Or at least you weren't at the time you conceived Gabriel. Edward took the paper with the result, reading and rereading the words. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Gabriel was his son, his biological son. That baby he loved with all his being was truly his. But this raised another question, a disturbing question. Doctor, if I'm the father, that means Marianne and I were together at some point over a year and a half ago, but we didn't know each other. We had never seen each other before that night I found her in the rain. The doctor frowned. That's unusual. Is Ms. Marianne sure you don't remember meeting before? She said the only relationship she had was with her ex-boyfriend. But now, if I'm the father, perhaps it would be wise to talk to her. There might have been an encounter that neither of you remembers, especially if alcohol consumption was involved. Edward nodded, still stunned. He put the paper back in the envelope, thanked the doctor and left the office like a zombie. He sat in his car and remained there for long minutes, trying to process everything. Gabriel was his son, his blood son. That connection he felt in the delivery room wasn't just empathy or compassion, it was recognition. It was a father recognizing his son. His body knew before his mind could comprehend. But how? How had they conceived Gabriel without knowing each other? Or had they met and not remembered? Edward drove back home slowly, his head a whirlwind of thoughts. When he arrived, Marianne was in the living room playing with Gabriel on the rug. She looked up when she saw him enter and immediately noticed something different. You went to get the result, didn't you? Edward nodded, unable to speak. He handed her the envelope. Marianne took it with trembling hands, opened it, and read. Her eyes widened, her mouth fell open in silent shock. How is this possible? She whispered. I don't know, but it's true. Gabriel is my son, Marianne, my biological son. She looked at Gabriel, who continued playing oblivious to the adults' conversation, and then looked back at Edward. But we were never together. I don't remember being with you. How did this happen? That's the burning question. The doctor suggested there might have been an encounter we don't remember. You were working at that institution, Hope Haven. I frequented the place. It's possible we met there. Marianne shook her head, trying to remember. I don't remember you. I swear I don't. Nor I you. But somehow it happened. And now Gabriel is here. Our son. Tears streamed down her face. Edward approached and pulled her into a hug. They stayed, like that for long minutes, embracing while Gabriel played at their feet, completely oblivious to the fact that his life, and that of his parents, had just changed forever. The truth had been revealed, but there were still mysteries to unravel, and Edward knew they needed to discover how it all happened, because now it wasn't just a beautiful story of encounter and redemption. It was a story of destiny intertwined even before they knew. The days following the revelation were an emotional roller coaster. Edward could barely stop looking at Gabriel. Every time he saw him, he felt a mixture of overwhelming joy and deep confusion. Gabriel was his son, truly his. But how? The question echoed incessantly in his mind. Marianne was also distraught. She spent hours trying to remember any detail of that time. She searched through her old belongings for any clue, any diary, any note that could shed light on the mystery. But all she found were fragmented and painful memories of her last months with Robert. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that Marianne received an unexpected call. The number was unknown, but she answered. Hello? Marianne? It's me, Robert. She felt her stomach churn. His voice, which once brought her some comfort, now only caused repulsion. What do you want? I want to see my son. He's not your son, Robert. You never wanted to know about him. You abandoned me when I was pregnant. But my name is on the certificate. I have rights, and I heard you're living in a mansion with a rich guy. You must be swimming in money now, right? Marianne felt anger rise in her throat. That's none of your business. You won't get near Gabriel. We'll see what the court says about that. My lawyer is already preparing the papers. Either you let me see the child or I'll sue you. And when I win, I'll ask for retroactive child support. Looks like your rich guy can pay well. And he hung up before she could reply. Marianne stood in the middle of the living room, the phone trembling in her hand. Edward entered at that moment, returning from a meeting, and immediately realized something was wrong. What happened? Robert called. He's threatening to sue me. He wants to see Gabriel and says he'll ask for child support. Edward felt fury explode in his chest. That man, who had abandoned Marianne, who left her on the streets pregnant, now wanted rights over Gabriel, over his son. He won't get anything. Not Gabriel, not money, nothing. I'm calling the lawyers right now. But his name is on the certificate, Edward. Legally, he's the father. Not anymore. We have the DNA test proving I am the biological father. We will file a paternity recognition suit and remove his name from the certificate. He has no rights. But it will take time, won't it? And in the meantime, he might try something. Edward picked up the phone and dialed his lead attorney, Dr. August Fletcher, one of London's most respected criminal lawyers. He quickly explained the situation. Dr. Fletcher, I need an urgent injunction. The man registered as Gabriel's father is making threats. We have the DNA test proving I am the biological father. I need immediate legal protection. I'll prepare everything today. Tomorrow morning we'll file the petition, and we'll also request a protective order preventing this man from approaching you. Do you have a record of the threats? The call was just now. It's recorded on Marianne's phone. Perfect. We need that recording. Send it to me by email as soon as possible. Edward hung up and looked at Marianne. We'll resolve this. He won't lay a finger on Gabriel. Marianne nodded, but fear was still etched on her face. Edward pulled her into a hug. I will protect you, always. In the following days, the legal battle began. Dr. Fletcher filed a petition for paternity recognition for Edward, attaching the DNA test as proof. He also requested the removal of Robert's name from the birth certificate and a protective order preventing him from approaching Marianne and Gabriel. The judge, upon reviewing the evidence and documents, granted a provisional injunction determining that Robert could not approach the family until the conclusion of the process. But Robert didn't give up easily. He hired a lawyer and contested everything, alleging that he had always been present in Gabriel's life, that Marianne was lying, that Edward was trying to buy the child. He invented absurd stories, trying to paint Marianne as a gold digger who abandoned him to be with a rich man. When Edward learned of the accusations, he was furious. This man has no limits. How can he invent all these lies? Marianne was devastated. Seeing her story distorted that way, being accused of things she never did, was too painful. Dr. Fletcher, however, was experienced. He gathered documentary evidence showing that Marianne had been kicked out of her home pregnant, that she spent days on the streets, that Robert never sought to know her whereabouts or the babies. He obtained testimonies from people who witnessed the abandonment. He built a solid and irrefutable case. The hearing was scheduled for a month later. During that month, the tension in the mansion was palpable. Edward doubled the house's security, hiring private guards to accompany Marianne whenever she went out. He didn't want to take any risks. It was during this tense period that Edward decided they needed to discover the truth about how Gabriel was conceived. Not just to satisfy his curiosity, but because it could be important for the legal process. If he could prove exactly when and where he and Marianne met, it would further strengthen the case. He began by investigating his own steps. He took his calendar from the previous year, tracing each day of December of that year. He discovered he had gone to Hope Haven on December 22nd, a Friday, to make a Christmas donation. He vaguely remembered that day. He had brought toys, clothes, and food for the children. He called the director of Hope Haven, Mrs. Beatrice, a 60-year-old woman who had managed the institution for decades. Mrs. Beatrice, this is Edward Alistair. How are you? Edward, what a surprise. All good, my dear, and with you? All good. Mrs. Beatrice, I need some information. Do you have a record of the volunteers who worked at the institution last December? Yes, I do. We have a spreadsheet with all the volunteers. Why? I'm trying to find information about a specific volunteer, Marianne Croft. She worked there while pregnant. Oh yes, Marianne, I remember her. A dear girl, always willing to help. She came twice a week, if I'm not mistaken. She stopped coming in February or March. I don't remember exactly. Do you remember if she was at the institution on December 22nd? Let me check the records here. Mrs. Beatrice was silent for a few moments, clearly searching for the information. Ah, yes, she was. She signed in that day. She helped with the Christmas party we held for the children. Edward's heart raced. And I was also there that day. I brought donations. That's right. I remember you arriving with a car full of boxes. The children were so happy. Mrs. Beatrice, by any chance, do you have photos from that day? Yes, I do. We always take photos at parties. Would you like me to send them to you by email? Please, it would be very important. I'll send them today. Edward hung up, his heart pounding. They had been in the same place on the same day. It was more than a coincidence. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. That night, Mrs. Beatrice's email arrived. Edward opened it on the living room computer with Marianne beside him. There were over 50 photos from the Christmas party. Children playing, adults serving food, Christmas decorations everywhere. And then they saw it. A photo where Edward appeared in the background talking to someone who wasn't visible. And in the foreground of the photo, Marianne, pregnant, smiling as she painted a child's face. We were in the same place, Marianne whispered, touching the computer screen. They continued scrolling through the photos, and then they found something that changed everything. A photo taken outside, in the institution's garden. It was a more secluded area, with some benches under trees. In the photo, blurred in the background, 2 people were talking. Edward zoomed in on the image. It was blurry, but it was possible to distinguish a man and a woman. The man was wearing a blue dress shirt, the same color Edward remembered wearing that day. The woman had dark hair tied in a ponytail and was clearly pregnant. "It's us," Edward said, his voice barely audible. "We talked that day." Marianne stared at the photo, trying to force her memory, and then, like a flash, a memory surfaced. Vague, incomplete, but a memory. "I remember," she whispered. "I was feeling dizzy. I hadn't eaten much that day because I didn't have money to buy proper food. I went out to get some air in the garden, and a man asked if I was okay. He offered water. We talked a little." Edward also began to remember, fragments of memory returning. "You said you were pregnant and going through difficulties. I gave you money. I gave you some notes and told you to use it to eat properly, to take care of the baby." Marianne covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down. "It was you. It was you who helped me that day. I didn't recognize you on the rainy night because I was so desperate, so focused on the pain. But it was you." The memories kept coming back. Edward remembered being impressed by her dignity, even amidst difficulty. He remembered feeling an immense desire to help more, but he didn't want to be intrusive. And then another flash of memory, more confused, more fragmented. "There was an empty room," Marianne said slowly. "A storage room. I was feeling unwell again later that day. Someone helped me sit down, gave me water. It was dark, I was dizzy." Edward also remembered something. A room, a confused moment. He had looked for Marianne after their conversation in the garden, worried, and found her disoriented near the storage area. He helped her sit down, but the details were hazy. There was something more, something he couldn't fully remember. "Marianne, you were fainting. I took you to a room to rest. I gave you water, food I had in the car. I stayed with you until you felt better." "How long were we there?" "I don't know, maybe an hour, maybe more." "You were very weak." And then the final, most shocking memory. Marianne remembered lying on that old sofa in the storage room. She remembered Edward sitting beside her, concerned. She remembered feeling an inexplicable connection with that kind stranger. And she vaguely remembered a moment of intimacy, confused, hazy, more a sensation than a clear memory. "We were together that day," Marianne said, barely able to believe it. "There, in that room." Edward nodded slowly, the pieces finally falling into place. "It was quick. It was confusing. I don't even clearly remember how it happened. I just remember feeling something, very strong for you at that moment. And then you left and I stayed there processing what had happened. When I looked for you afterward, you were already gone. And I didn't clearly remember your face. I was so confused, so tired. When I got home that day, I thought it had just been a strange dream. And then with everything that happened with Robert, I simply blocked that memory." They stood in silence, absorbing the truth. Gabriel was conceived that day, in a moment of inexplicable connection between two strangers who were destined to meet again. "This changes everything," Edward said. "We are not only Gabriel's biological father and mother. We chose each other that day, even without consciously knowing it." Marianne nodded, her tears now of emotion and not sadness. Destiny was writing our story from the very beginning. In the days that followed this revelation, Edward and Marianne talked at length about everything. About that day, about the memories that returned, about the meaning of it all. They also decided they needed to tell the complete truth to the lawyers, as that information would further strengthen the legal case. Dr. Fletcher was impressed with the story. "This is extraordinary, and we have photographic evidence that you were in the same place on the same day. This completely invalidates any claim that Robert is the father. The conception period perfectly coincides with that December 22nd. "And what about Robert being on the certificate?" Edward asked. "We will request a complete rectification. With the evidence we now have, the DNA test and the documentation of your encounter, the judge will have no option but to recognize you as the legal father and remove Robert's name." The hearing finally arrived. It was on a cloudy August day, almost a year after that rainy night when it all began. The courthouse was full, but the hearing room was reserved only for the parties involved. Robert arrived with his lawyer, a slovenly-looking man who clearly took the case just for the money. When he saw Edward and Marianne entering, he scoffed. "Look at that, the little princess and the rich guy," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Edward had to hold himself back from reacting. Marianne squeezed his hand, asking for calm. The judge entered and everyone stood. He was a man in his 50s with a serious and professional expression. He sat down and began reading the case files. "We are here to rule on the paternity recognition petition filed by Mr. Edward Alistair regarding the minor Gabriel Croft Alistair, currently registered as the son of Robert Henry Smith. Mr. Edward, you may present your evidence." Dr. Fletcher stood up and began to present the case meticulously. He showed the DNA test, the photos from Hope Haven, the testimonies of people who saw Robert abandon Marianne, the medical records from the hospital where Gabriel was born, showing that Edward paid for everything and was present. He also showed the recordings of the threats Robert made. Robert's lawyer tried to contest, but his arguments were weak and easily refuted. He alleged that the DNA test could have been falsified, but had no proof. He alleged that Marianne was a gold digger, but all witnesses spoke about her character. When it was Robert's turn to speak, he appeared nervous and contradictory. He said he always wanted to see his son, but couldn't explain why he kicked Marianne out of the house while she was pregnant. He said he had rights, but couldn't cite a single moment when he had exercised those rights. The judge listened to everything patiently. Then, after almost 3 hours of hearing, he struck the gavel. "Given the evidence presented, it is clear that Mr. Edward Alistair is the biological father of the minor Gabriel Croft Alistair. The DNA test is conclusive, and the photographic and testimonial evidence corroborates the allegations. On the other hand, Mr. Robert Henry Smith has not demonstrated any emotional or financial bond with the child since his birth.